And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Ceiba Sebastian, who during her near-death experience went through a fourth-dimensional hypercube, also known as a Tesseract, which we'll learn about today and more. Ceiba, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Actually, you've had two NDEs. So let's start with your first one and go from there.
Okay. So the first NDE, I actually got caught in a riptide. So it was a drowning or a near drowning. I thought, in a pretty safe area of the water. And wow, it took me pretty fast. And it was so strong that by the time I even realized I was in a riptide, I was so far away from shore that I was almost past the last wave break. And I knew that if I got swept past that wave break, that I would be at open sea, and that would be it. I mean, nobody was going to see me out there. I was by myself, and there were only a couple of other people on that beach at all. And so I knew once I was caught in that riptide that I was in a fair amount of trouble. And so I started to fight pretty hard, to try to get myself back to shore. But it was so strong, this riptide. I mean, I really could almost not move. It was almost straight jacketing my body. It was moving so fast. And so I very, very quickly got really tired out, got exhausted. And I did make it back almost about like waist deep at one point. And I was able to dig one foot in the sand, and then it ripped me right back. And when that happened, I really panicked. It was really clear then that I was in some pretty serious trouble. And I got swept way back out again. And I mean, at this point, I'm just can barely breathe. I felt like I couldn't even really inhale. I was hyperventilating so badly. And I was physically completely exhausted. And I mean, I was experiencing pure terror, just pure terror, because I knew that I was in, this was really bad. And right at that point, I heard, it was kind of like an inner voice. It was sort of my voice, but not my voice. Hard to explain. It was maybe like a higher self or some kind of higher wisdom that said very, very clearly and calmly, it's not going to be a bad death. Give it about 30 seconds and it'll all be over. And right then I went into this very tranquil, peaceful state. I wasn't at all upset or sad that I was going to die. I didn't even feel like I needed to try to fight anymore. I wasn't scared, nothing. I felt completely at peace, which I found really interesting to think about later, because, I think we're all really terrified of that moment of passing, of crossing, and what it's going to be like, especially if it's traumatic. And so I can't speak for everyone, but for myself, I could say that really there was terror, but after that point, there was complete peace and calm, even though I knew I was going to die. It was very clear. And strangely, I don't remember anything at all. It's like everything just went completely black. And then the next thing I knew, I was standing facing the shore in about knee-deep water. And I have no idea how I got there. I have no idea how I got there. I don't know anything that transpired from the point that I went really calm and tranquil and basically accepted my death. And I was still kind of hyperventilating, but I noticed that I felt this extreme calm and tranquility. And I remember thinking, it's kind of interesting, even though my body was clearly still going through some pretty intense trauma from what had just happened, my mind, my being was quite calm. And I remember looking out back at the shore, and it was kind of a jungle area, and everything looked hyper beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful anyway, but it looked almost surreal, just incredibly beautiful. And I had this thought, which again came from this inner voice, higher self. And it said very clearly, I love everyone and everyone loves me. But it wasn't like, it wasn't sort of this way we would think of in our kind of reality, this feeling. It was a very universal, kind of ubiquitous love, and it was completely reciprocal. I remember noting that it was a completely reciprocal feeling. So the amount of love that I was feeling through my body, I was that I felt like I was giving, I was getting in equal measures. There wasn't any discrepancy. It was just this very pure feeling, both within and without. And it was, you know, I don't think we could experience anything like that here with our psyches. I don't know, but it was very incredibly beautiful and surreal. And at that point, I did not know if I was alive or dead. I wasn't sure because I was in this very interesting state, and everything looked quite different physically. And so I thought maybe I had died and this was kind of a heaven. I wasn't sure. So I got back to my towel on the beach, and I was so kind of confused, because I clearly something had happened to me that had rendered me into this radically different state of being. But it did appear that I was still in our living reality. And so I grabbed a handful of sand, I was like, am I alive? And I could feel the sand and it ran through my fingers. And I was like, well, I guess I am. I can feel this sand and I seem to be here. So I got my breathing calmed down. And I just remember thinking next, like, that should have been a very traumatizing experience, but I felt great. I felt really happy, doesn't even really describe it. I mean, it was like I just was in this incredible state of love. I was feeling loved, and so much love that I wasn't at all bothered about the fact that I had either just drowned or almost drowned. I'm not sure. And I remember thinking that was a bit odd, that I wasn't at all affected in a negative way whatsoever by what had just happened. So then I was on this little small island, and I had to take a little boat to get back where I was going to meet my sister. We were traveling together, and then that was our last day. We were going to fly out from there. And so the other two people, the mother and daughter who were surfing, the only other two people who were out there, ended up on the boat with me to go back. And so we were talking, and I remember something so interesting. The woman, the mother, was a scientist with the Smithsonian, and she was actually, we were in Panama. She was there studying this particular leaf eater ant. And I remember as I was speaking with her that I had the sense of knowing everything that she was talking about. I knew all of her scientific references. It was sort of like a kind of state of omniscience in a way. I have a slight science background, but definitely not a background in science. Though it was interesting, I didn't have any questions about what she was saying. I seemed to be able to understand her and ask questions as if I was a colleague. And I remember thinking that it was interesting that I seemed to understand everything about her science or her area of science. But I didn't think too much about it. Anyway, we got back to the other area where I was supposed to be meeting my sister, and she was off shopping and getting some things, and so I was waiting for her in a restaurant. And the next thing that I noticed that was really interesting was that I at this point, it was very clear that something had radically changed in my being. I was so different. I felt really great. I still had this overwhelming sense of love and well-being, and I kept thinking to myself, what is going on? Like I'm not sad that it's happening. I'm really glad. I don't feel dismayed by my state of being, but I'm just so curious about it. And as I was asking this question really in earnest, like I really want to know, I simultaneously heard and then looked up and saw this immense portal in the sky. It's hard to describe it. It was like just like a giant portal. And from this portal came this voice, which was very, it's like a booming voice, but it wasn't loud, and it was very strong, but it wasn't aggressive. It was very neutral, and it felt kind, but also very strong. And it said, "It just is." And I was like, "What does that mean?" It just is. I don't know what that means. And then the voice repeated it again. It just is. And that's when I kind of had this, I don't know how to describe it other than like a download of information that doesn't come in like linear thought, A plus B type of thing. It just was sort of a knowing that kind of descended on me all at once about what that meant. And it took me a long time to really process that afterward. But at that time, it seemed very clear. Even though it's very simple, it has a complexity to it, for us. So anyway, I went and sat in this restaurant, and then as I was sitting there, I started to all of a sudden get just tons of information about the human body and about why and how disease manifests for us and why and how aging manifests. And I noticed something really particular that was quite interesting. So where I was in this another little island where I was sitting and waiting for my sister, it was pretty touristic. And so there were a lot of people passing by in front of the restaurant, and a lot of families were passing by. And the first thing I noticed that was very different was that they felt like they were behind this very thick layer of plexiglass, is the only way I can describe it. So it felt like I was in, I don't know how to describe it. I was in the present reality, and they were not there. They were physically there, but it's like they were gone mentally. It was a very, very strange experience. And at the same time that I was noticing that, I could see so clearly how the patterns flow from, for example, like a parent to a child in terms of how we manifest. I think we're now understanding the whole process of epigenetics versus just genetic triggers in the body. But it was so clear how everything is really epigenetic, that everything that moves through our body, we pick up from the field in general, that it's not really inherent or innate in the physical form, that it actually does, it is passed through our body from the field. So it's kind of like a learned and taken in type of expression in the body. And that's when I began to understand that the disease process is really from the field at large, that it's something that moves through the body and is expressed through the body in that way, that it's not inherent to the body, and that aging is the same thing, that it's it sounds really strange to say that aging is learned, but it is learned. It's kind of a patterned response that we choose in a kind of an unconscious way to express through our bodies. And we're generally just patterning ourselves after our parents or the people with whom we've spent, our very formative time. And that we also pattern ourselves deeply through our body according to what we're exposed to in our environment, our cultures, the people around us, and how all of that is being expressed. But I think what I feel is really important about what I learned there is that it's not innate to the body itself, that our bodies are really clear, and that's something that comes through from the larger field based on patterns that we encounter. And so that was a very interesting experience. And I, at the same time, was getting a lot of information, very specific information about the biochemistry of the body, which is not a background of mine at all. And so that took me quite a long time. There's still a lot of it that I haven't been able to really put together completely, that I got from that time period just sitting in the restaurant. But this whole experience continued on for about a month after I had that NDE. And I would just sit at night and journal, almost like kind of like automatic writing in a way. It just was this information that kept coming and coming. And there were times when I would sit and write, I would look at the clock and like 5 hours would have passed. And I had no sense of fatigue, no sense of being tired, and this would be until, 4 or 5 in the morning sometimes, and I'd have to get up and go to work the next day. And I felt no repercussions from, staying and writing like that for 4 or 5 hours at night. And I filled journals with all of this very interesting information that came to me from that. And from there, after that experience, my life really became radically different and has never ever returned to the way it was. It really altered my trajectory in a very radical way, which was another interesting occurrence from that.
Well, let me ask you this. There was a voice that you heard while you were in the ocean, and then there was another voice you heard when the portal opened. Were those two completely different voices?
Yeah, they were different. The one that I heard in the ocean, which I feel like was also the same essence as the one who expressed the love coming out of the ocean, felt like me, but not the personality me, more like I would call it maybe like a higher self. Um, and the one coming from the portal was distinctly different. It had a male essence to it. It had a deeper, what we would associate more with a male voice. And it was absolutely distinctly not me, distinctly different. Yeah, and also it felt the voice from the ocean felt like it was within my essence, and the voice in the portal felt like it was definitely not part of my being. Though at that point everything felt universally inherently connected. I could tell that it was distinctly not arising from the essence of who I was. Yeah.
Who do you think that the voice in the portal was?
I, it's so hard to say. I'm not really religious, so I wouldn't necessarily associate it, with like a God character or anything like that. Um, it felt benevolent. It had a neutrality to it, so it didn't, there wasn't like it didn't have like what we would maybe consider a spiritual essence, if that makes any sense. It just felt very neutral. Maybe just the essence of a higher mm, wisdom is kind of how I would see it. Just the expression of a higher wisdom that maybe is a kind of universal wisdom. I guess some people could call that God. Um, yeah, yeah.
Let me see if I got the timeline straight. You were in the ocean and you were about to drown and you got a message, just relax, and you basically surrendered to death. And then you blacked out until you were on the basically back on the shore. In that time that passed, do you think you were unconscious, or perhaps you were having an experience that you don't have memory of?
I wonder about that. I wonder about that because I literally have zero recall. um, it this is going to sound really strange, but the sense that I get is that I experienced some kind of something beyond our time and space, and that I essentially went from being there um, and completely accepting my death and feeling very tranquil about it, and then I get the sense that nothing happened in between, that it was kind of like a transportation, if that makes sense, that it was just sort of, I'm here and now I'm here. um, it's just the sense I get. I feel like if I had blacked out, I would have had, some kind of memory of things, how you kind of get this narrow tunnel vision when you start to lose consciousness. There just was none of that. It was literally just like like I was just standing there all of a sudden.
Oh, well, I don't think that if you just blacked out and went unconscious that you would have just automatically floated to the shore. You probably just would have drowned out there.
That's my thought. Or even if a wave had pulled me closer, or I just, how would I be standing, just standing suddenly looking at the ocean again? It's I think about it a lot, actually. Um, it was a very strange, very different sort of thing that I just was standing there. Yeah.
All right, well, let's move forward to your second NDE where you were in the Tesseract.
Right. Okay. So the next NDE was about 8 years later. Um, and it was so different from the first NDE, so different. But it did also have some very interesting characteristics to it. I had gone for a hike and I was out the entire day, and I was living in the mountains. So it was pretty cold. And so I was very bundled up. I'm kind of cold natured. And so I had these big high boots and lots of layers and wool, a wool hat, big wool sweater. And I hadn't had a lot to eat or drink. I just didn't bring a lot with me. I don't think I knew or realized I was going to be gone for so long. So I think I was already in state of dehydration. And I guess, I don't know if the elevation affected it. I'm not sure. But anyway, I got back to the cabin where I was living, And my boyfriend at the time made this really big fire. The cabin had a huge fireplace and a hearth because that was the only way to heat it. And I would always sit on the hearth to get warm. And this day I did the same thing, but I didn't take anything off because I was just feeling really chilled. It was kind of rainy and wet outside, and I just was, you get that kind of cold chill, and I felt like I just couldn't get warm. And so I sat on this hearth, and I don't know how long it was, but I do think maybe a couple of hours. I was just relaxing and enjoying and talking with my boyfriend and just feeling relaxed. I didn't take anything off because I didn't feel uncomfortable or hot. Felt quite ambient. And my boyfriend went into the kitchen to start to cook dinner. And I remember all of a sudden I went from feeling fine to feeling like something terrible was about to happen to my body. It was a very strange experience. It wasn't like, wow, I feel bad. It was sort of like something really bad's about to happen because of something that was happening physically. And I remember looking, it was a very small little cabin, just a little one room basically, and there was a couch against one wall and a little kitchen table with some chairs against the other. And I remember very distinctly, it was kind of like the voice in the ocean that said, if you go and lay down on that couch, you're never going to get up. The implication was that I was going to die on that couch, that I just couldn't lay down. And I thought, this is really bad. I didn't know at all what was happening, and it felt like it just happened so fast. And so I thought, okay, I've just got to get myself over across the room, essentially, into this chair. And I felt like I couldn't even really get up off the hearth, but I just had this very strong sense that I had to get closer to my boyfriend, but he wasn't really paying much attention at that point. He was just, doing his thing cooking. And I thought, I've got to get his attention. And so I went and just kind of fell into this chair, and I told him, I was like, I think I'm gonna faint. And I remember he looked over at me, and then I could immediately see that he was very concerned. And I have no idea what I looked like, but clearly something looked awry. And he came over, and I remember he reached under my sweater. He's like, oh my God, you're burning up. And I guess wool, it has a really strange effect. I guess it was kind of like insulating my body. So it was keeping all this heat in, and I guess I didn't realize it. And so we started just kind of pulling all these layers off. And I asked him, I was like, can you bring me some water and some honey? Because I could tell that I was starting to lose consciousness. And I just was so fearful at that point because it just didn't feel like, I said I was going to faint, but I could tell that it was going to be something different than just fainting. I can't describe it, but it felt very ominous, very ominous. And I ate the honey and I chugged water, but at that point, I guess it was too late. And I told him, I'm like, I'm going to lose consciousness. And he stood in front of me. He's like, okay, if you're going to faint, I'm going to catch you, don't worry. And right as he said that, I remember losing consciousness. Everything kind of just went into black. And I remember falling forward. And then from there, what I experienced was something very different than what he experienced. But what I experienced was all of a sudden, I'm just spinning out of control, just like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Gravity, where the Sandra Bullock character, I think she gets disconnected from the ship or something. Anyway, she's just spinning completely out of control. It was that feeling of I couldn't get myself righted. And as that was happening, it seemed like I was moving at just warp speed through this, what looked like just a big grid. And it was multicolored, and I would call the colors neon, except that they were way brighter than what we would see neon here to be. I mean, they were extraordinarily bright, amazing colors. And I remember thinking, like, where am I? Like, what is going on? I was so confused. I was really scared. I was really dismayed. I could not figure out what was happening. I didn't have any memory at all of like what had happened, like that I had passed out or anything like that. That wasn't connecting at all to what was happening to me then. I just was in a state of just confusion and fear, because I just was spinning and spinning and going through this grid, and it just was all so bizarre and unfamiliar. And I kept saying, to myself, what's happening? Where am I? What's happening? And then the next thing I know, I'm just sort of like in this, it's like the inkiest, black, velvety, rich, warm, loving, dark, black, vast space. I mean, inky black. I don't even think we could recreate that here in this reality. It was so black. But the strange thing the sense was that, like, if you held your hand up in a really dark environment, you would still kind of have the essence of your hand in front of you, and this was like a different kind of dark. And the strange thing was that it felt so warm and loving, and I felt it was just this deep sense of peace and calm. And the space itself, though there was no sense of an actual space, it just felt infinite, just infinite. But it felt very inviting and loving and warm. So it was just kind of this big contradiction of being in this inky black space, but at the same time, I felt very cocooned, and it felt very loving, and it felt very alive and sentient. I remember thinking that it felt there was sentience there. And I kept thinking, where am I? What is happening? And at that point, I kind of like I sort of drifted over, and I don't know how I knew that there were three beings, because they were very, it was like a vapory, wispy sort of presence. They weren't actual figures there, but I could distinctly tell that there were three, and they seemed to be huge, which is also really strange, because I didn't have, or as far as I could tell, there was no form. I had no form, no body. I don't remember thinking I didn't have a body, but it just didn't feel like there was a body, that I was associated with a body. But the strange thing is, I remember having to look way up at these beings. They just were enormous. And we had what felt like a pretty serious conversation. It felt like, it just felt really serious. Like we were discussing something that was very essential to me. That had a very essential nature to it. But I have no memory at all of what was discussed, nor did I really at the time cognitively understand anything that was being said. I could kind of know or sense that we were discussing something. And I've tried many times. I even went through hypnotherapy to try to recall that conversation, and it is just absolutely, I can remember it. I can remember the essence of being with the beings, even now as I'm talking about it, very clearly, but that conversation remains completely elusive. So I'm not sure why that is. And then as we were speaking, I heard this, I jokingly call it the Charlie Brown voice, the adult on the phone, the wah, wah, wah. And I hear this sound, but I also want to say that to be really clear about this, I wasn't a person. So when I say there wasn't a sense of me being myself. And I'm saying that because when I heard the sound, it was just like, it was sort of like something got my attention, but I couldn't tell that it was a sound per se or a voice or anything like that. There just wasn't any notion of anything personal or from a person or personality. And I sort of turned my head, my focus toward this sound that had gotten my attention. And I see the earth very clearly, the globe, the earth itself, and I could see the atmosphere around the earth, this very bright, white, kind of misty, which I now understand was the atmosphere. But I had no sense of knowing that I was looking at planet Earth. That it didn't occur to me. That wasn't anything I thought about. I can now that I look, when I look back into the memory of this, I can clearly see it was Earth. But in that moment of that experience, I had no idea. It didn't occur to me that it was anything at all. And so then I turned back to the beings and I hear this sound again. It gets my attention. I turn again, I'm seeing the earth, and it was, I do remember it was very bright and very beautiful. The colors in the inky black, the blue was just, and the white around it was magnificent. And I turned again to the beings, and then I distinctly heard Ceiba, but I didn't associate that with myself. I didn't know what that was or who that was. But when I heard that Ceiba, suddenly I was again like rushing, just warp speed toward this thing, which I now understand was my body. But I didn't know that's what that was at the time. I'm just rushing toward this object. And then I remember distinctly seeing the backs of my eyelids. Though I didn't know what that was, I didn't register that as eyelids or a body. And the next thing that I knew, I was looking, and there was a face, but a person looking at me very closely. The face was very close to mine, but I didn't think of it as a face or a human or a body or a person. It was very strange. There was nothing, still like no personal ideology at this time. But I remember noticing that the eyes of this being looked very distressed, like they were very, very distressed, tremendous dismay. And then at that point, I kind of looked side to side, and I was still feeling so confused about where I was and what was happening. But I felt really great. I felt warm. I still had that sense of warmth, love. My body felt, I didn't even really feel like I had a body. I felt like I was floating on a cloud. And so I asked, the first question was, where am I? And this person, this being says, you're at home. And I was like, I don't know what that means. I still had no association with who I was or who this was. Obviously it was my boyfriend, but I said, okay. And he then asked, he's like, how do you feel? I was like, I feel perfect. And that didn't seem strange to me, but I remember his face registering kind of like, oh, just like a look of surprise. And I was like, am I, and then I realized, oh, I'm laying down. I'm on the floor. And this was also really interesting because we were in this very cold, cabin at 8,000 feet up in the mountains. And it normally would have been a very cold experience to be laying on this cement floor. I was down in my tank top because, I'd taken all my layers off. So normally it would have been pretty cold. And I didn't even feel like I was touching the surface of the floor at all. I really felt like I was floating in this very warm, beautiful cloud. And I said, I want to sit up. And he's like, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, what's the problem? I couldn't understand at all why he was in such a state of dismay. And I start to sit up and I realize like I don't have kind of full control of the body. And he's helping me a little bit. And I'm like, why are you helping me? I can sit up. And then as I kind of sit up, I look down at my hands and they had really curled up, kind of like a person who's had sort of some neurological experience or expression through their body. They were kind of curled up like that. And you were thinking, oh wow, that's weird. It didn't feel bad. It just seemed really strange. And then as I sat up, I could see from my torso down, and it distinctly looked like a dead body. It didn't look like there was any life at all in that body. And then as I continued to sit up, it was sort of like I just reanimated as I was sitting up. It didn't feel badly. I still felt felt like I had plenty of vitality. I felt very energetic. But I did notice that the body looked like it had experienced something. And it did look like it was not alive as I was kind of moving my energy into it. And then I stood completely up and I felt very great. I had tons of energy. I could have done any kind of physical activity. But, obviously at that point I was starting to kind of regain some, awareness of the environment. And I asked my boyfriend, what happened? I had no memory at all of feeling terrible, of fainting, none of it. I really had no idea. I could just tell something obviously had happened. I was on the floor. He looked, terrified. Something obviously had happened. And we went and sat down and he just literally started to sob, And I thought, oh my, what happened? And he tells me, he's like, you had a grand mal seizure, and you fell to the floor, and then you seized for about 2 minutes. And then once the seizure subsided, you just died. He's like, your eyes stopped tracking. They went in different directions. You stopped breathing. You didn't have a pulse. You didn't feel like you had a heartbeat. It's like you died. And I was like, I just didn't even, I didn't even know what to think about that. And then, it started to make a little bit of sense, this very strange experience that I had had, during this time. And then after he got calmed down and we were talking about it a little more, he's like, something really interesting happened, because I felt so good also. And he was amazed and thought that was very strange and bizarre how well I felt, considering my body had just been through this horrific thing. And he said, you did look, he said, when you first came back, he said, there was no shift at all. Suddenly you just were there. And he said, you were just looking at me. And he said, the interesting thing about it is that he called it salon fresh. I don't know why he was using that term, but he said, you looked like you had just, like, your hair looked perfectly done. He's a photographer, so he speaks about light in that way. And he said, you looked like you were lit from the inside. He's like, you looked like you had 360-degree lighting. He said, you looked like you were about 20 years old. He's like, you just looked like you were very young. And at the time I was about 48. So that was definitely, I would say, a big change in my appearance, which obviously didn't last. But there was some very interesting thing that happened as the body reanimated itself. And the fact that I had no physical repercussions at all and haven't to this day. I often think, did something happen to my kidneys? Did I, obviously it was severe dehydration and overheating that caused the body to die. But there apparently has been no physical effect from that whatsoever, as far as I know.
I'm pretty sure I had a guest before that her son died on Mount Everest due to dehydration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you tell us about the Tesseract?
The Tesseract, yeah, so that was the grid that I went flying through. And so I didn't, at the time, of course, did not know at all what it was that I was seeing. But I remember thinking, this is a grid. And it was very grid-like, very grid-like. And I remember thinking, like, what is this? And the reason I call it a Tesseract is that a couple of years after that experience, I saw the movie called Interstellar. And the character goes through a black hole. And when he goes through the black hole, he ends up in what he's calling a Tesseract. And it was exactly what I had seen as I guess I was leaving my body. But the colors, of course, in the film weren't as bright as the ones that I saw when I went through, the actual Tesseract. But I remember being so surprised when I watched that movie and saw that scene. I was like, oh my God, that is exactly what I was moving through when I had that second NDE. And I looked into it. I looked into the film, it was expressing in that scene, and that's how I learned that that's a Tesseract or a Hypercube. And I don't know what that means in terms of how that relates to what I'm supposed to get from the NDE, other than just what it looks like to move out of 3D time space and into another dimensional expression, because the Tesseract, of course, is a fourth dimensional form.
So you were looking at this grid system with multiple cubes or squares, and within each cube or square, were you seeing memories or other dimensions?
It just looked, it was all inky black. And as I because I was also spinning completely, what felt like completely out of control. So it was all kind of just whizzing by through my vision very quickly. But it looked like each cube there was something in there, but I couldn't see what was in there. It was like a very, almost like a distorted space within each one, but I couldn't tell at all what was in there. I just was moving so fast through it, and I was so disoriented. But yeah, it didn't have there was nothing in terms of like memories or anything associated with my life or my reality at all in that experience.
Who do you think those three beings were?
I I ponder this often because I would very much like to know. And also what's so interesting about it is that their size. And so, if I had to guess, I would say they are obviously from some other dimensional reality. Um, it felt like they were giving me some kind of information, or we were talking very much in earnest. So if I had to really say, I assume that we would have some kind of connection. There would be some reason that they would be discussing something with me. It felt pretty businesslike, to be honest. It didn't feel warm and fuzzy. It felt very, almost like not being lectured, but it felt like it was like something needed to be said to me, or something needed to be cleared up, or they were telling me something in earnest that needed to be clarified for me. Felt like I was on the receiving end of some sort of like, not quite a reprimand, but more of a, this is how this needs to go kind of thing is my sense of it. So mentors of a sort, maybe the beings, maybe a galactic family connection. If I had to guess, I would say that's probably closer to it, some sort of galactic connection to me.
Many people describe angels as being really big, so I thought perhaps maybe that's what you experienced.
Yeah, they did not, as far as I could sense them, my feeling about it wasn't angelic, but also I'm not religious and wasn't really raised religious, so I have no real association with that kind of archetypal ideology, and so I don't know if that made a difference in the way that I perceived them. But it definitely, there wasn't this kind of loving, soft energy. It was very firm, sort of energy. It wasn't mean. I mean, I wasn't afraid, or I didn't feel shamed or guilty. There was nothing like that happening. But it definitely wasn't any sort of like soft, loving energy for sure.
Obviously, we're both just guessing, but I would probably think something like they told you, okay, well, this is what's going on, and you need to go back, and you're not going to remember this conversation, and here you are.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so strange that I can't remember any of it. I'm sure there's obviously a very good reason for that, and it did feel like it was some sort of like, okay, here's how this needs to go. So if I guess it's just was some sort of discussion about what needed to happen in my life and what direction my life needed to take, um, and that type of thing. If I had to give a good guess.
Well, since you've been back after that one, has your life taking a different direction?
Yes, yes. So I since the first NDE, um, I would say that I've just slowly unraveled from mainstream culture, to the point where after the second NDE, I can hardly be within mass culture or mainstream culture. Can't, I just don't identify at all anymore, at all, with culture, with these patterns and these overlays and it just all looks like a false structure to me now. It just all looks so contrived and such a drag on our energy systems, such a drag on who we truly are as human beings. It just feels very painful for me to be within it and to be witnessing it. I just can't. I already couldn't to a large degree after the first one. And then it seems after the second one, I have just really not been able, it just seems to be getting more and more to the point where I can hardly be part of any of that structure at all. And I'm obviously from a very Western culture, but I never identified with that culture, even from the time I was a very small child. But at this point, I feel so completely divested from that culture that I can't even associate with it anymore. Just, yeah, I have no desire to be anywhere near it.
Would you say that the other side is more real than here, or this is more real and the other side is like a dream?
Well, of course, as I was experiencing it, it felt, it doesn't have the linear characteristics that we associate with with this reality. You know, cycles and time frames seem to go on and move forward directionally. But the feelings that I felt there, I know for sure are how we should be feeling here. But we haven't been able to access that yet because there's just so much indoctrination and overlay and so much. Some people call it illusion, the illusion, or just so much interference with our true nature that I am 100% sure that what is felt there, and I know what other NDE experiencers have spoken about, and it's very similar to mine, is really what the true reality would be here without all of that stuff in the way.
At this point in your life, do you fear death at all?
No, not at all. Not at all.
After watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that? And if so, how do they contact you?
Yeah, that's fine. I have a website. It's the material that I downloaded from the first NDE, which has come over the years into an ideology. And so my Gmail account is on that website if anybody wants to go there. It doesn't talk about the NDE, but they can find my Gmail there.
What's the website called?
So it's called the Tao of Equipoise, spelled Tau of Equipoise, EQUIPOISE, Tao of Equipoise.
Well, do you have anything that you're working on that you want us to know about?
Yeah, I have a lot that came through. Just, I would say that obviously these times, you know, are incredibly tumultuous. And the way that I see it and understand it is that really we're beginning to move into our true nature. And so this tumultuous expression is really kind of a breaking up of all of this overlay and all of this illusory kind of false nature of what's overlaying our true nature. It's really all just kind of, just imagine, you know, an earthquake kind of beginning to rattle and shake things and break things, and, you know, it tears huge, big cement buildings to rubble. So that's kind of what's happening, I feel like, in our realities. This is starting to break down all of those really rigid structures that have been dictating and overlaying our true nature for a very, very long time. And to really begin allowing fluidity of your own being, so that things aren't as polarized in thinking anymore. It doesn't have to be a this or a that, but it can just be anything in between, and it can go back and forth and, you know, any which way. And all of that is really the true nature, and that we've been told that things are really static and solid, and they're really not at all. And so, you know, embracing the fluidity that's coming and that's emerging and arising, I would say is really, yeah.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
We have a true nature that has absolutely nothing to do with what is reflected on the outside in the outside world. That is truly an inner alchemy, and it is our purpose is to allow that to be expressed into the world, because this alchemy is going to join with and become part of a greater alchemy that is really going to allow us true freedom.
Ceiba, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.